Today's scripture reading comes from Exodus chapter 18, verses 5 through 12. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, together with Moses' sons and wife, came to him in the wilderness, where he was camped near the mountain of God. Jethro had sent word to him, "I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons." So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. They greeted each other and then went into the tent. Moses told his father-in-law about everything the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and about all the hardships they had met along the way and how the Lord had saved them. Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things the Lord had done for Israel in rescuing them from the hand of the Egyptians. He said, "Praise be to the Lord who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now, I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly." Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God, and Aaron, with all the other elders of Israel, to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God.
So the Surgeon General issued an interesting advisory here in the last few weeks. The Surgeon General will talk about various health crises, but this one was describing the health crisis of loneliness. As they went through and traced the data, they talked about how loneliness is it's a public health crisis. It's affecting the health of Americans. And it compared, the advisory compared loneliness and its effects, the depression, all these kind of the ramifications it has. It says it's worse than smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's worse than the health effects of obesity. It's worse than the health effects of physical inactivity. Now, the reason why Americans are lonely people, struggling with loneliness, are myriad. Many of them long-standing. I can remember over 20 years ago reading a book called Bowling Alone that was talking about the loss of social groups in our culture. I can remember Jacob Dawson, I think I mentioned this before, when he came to visit. He's having dinner with us at our house, and we're walking the neighborhood afterwards, and he's talking about the differences from Ghana and the U.S., and he said one of the biggest differences that always strikes him when he's in America is how empty the streets are. We'd walk the neighborhoods and walk through our neighborhood here and walking the streets, walking through the park, and there's never anybody, never people. One or two, you see somebody walking a dog. That's not Jacob's neighborhood in Ghana. You walk the streets in Ghana, there's always people that you're encountering. He said there's something about American culture that drives us to be alone. And of course that was amplified in COVID. We went through this public health crisis that the world forced us to choose between health and relationship. And now a few years later, the government's turning around and saying, well, it turns out that we lost both as a effect of that. It turns out we're relational people. Our deep need is relationship. And the good news for us is that as Christians, we celebrate and honor a God who is fundamentally relational. And in fact, we are celebrating and the beneficiaries of a gospel, the good news that is primarily relational. The story of Scripture can be told entirely in relational terms, that we see how the reality of sin has led to a place where we have broken relationships in our lives. Ours are broken relationships with God, with other people, with ourselves, with the creation itself. Our world is broken, our relationships are broken, and the good news of Jesus Christ is about restoring each of those relationships. So Jesus is God incarnate, and so he is restoring us into right relationship with God himself. He calls us to be part of a body of believers where he is restoring our ability to relate to one another. He is restoring our relationships with others. He's in fact helping us see ourselves and root our identity in Christ, and so we are restoring our relationship with self. And thus, as redeemed people, we go out into the world and we pursue good. So a creation that is groaning because of sin can delight that the people of God can seek its restoration. Our God is a relational God, and is the gospel that unites us and heals relationships. Well, Exodus 18 is an interesting exploration of that. There's an interesting balance. We saw it last week in Exodus 17, and we see it again in 18, though it's in reverse order. In Exodus 17, we talked about God providing water for his people in a miraculous way. In a sense, what that's been doing is really thinking about Israel and the people of God is they've had to look in themselves and look at their, really look inward. Who are they as a people? Understanding who they are. And then at the end of Exodus 17, it looked outward. Now they have this outer enemy. The Amalekites are coming. And so they're thinking about how is it that the people of God are going to relate to this hostile world that they're living in. Well, here in chapter 18, we're going to reverse that. He's going to have us think outwardly, think about how the people of God, the work of God in the book of Exodus, how it's affecting the world around them, and then ultimately then turn to how it then affects them as a people. So if you don't have your Bibles open, I'd encourage you to open them to Exodus 18. It's all centered around the story of Jethro. Jethro we've talked about him before. He's the father-in-law of Moses. He's a Midianite. He's a priest in Midian. That's the way this verse 1 opens here in chapter 18. And we see Jethro. He was there. Moses was with him. He met him there, saved his family. All these great things happened. And Moses spent 40 years with him. He worked for him. He was a shepherd, kind of tending Jethro's flocks. And then, of course, it's when he's tending Jethro's flocks that Moses was called by God to go and redeem his people. So now he went off on this great adventure. He married one of his daughters. Now they're reuniting. So verse 1, we pick up with him, and we see Jethro coming back. He's priest of Midian. And what has he done is he has heard all that God had done for Moses. So Jethro really opens us to think about our mission in the world. And really, I think a lot of ways we can frame the story of Jethro first is around the theme of evangelism. And that verse 1, I think, is the first thing I want us to see about that mission, because what we see is that God goes before us in advancing the gospel. How do we bring the gospel to the world? Well, we are actually then going to go join what God has already done. The first thing you see in the story is that what motivates Jethro is that he's been hearing things. The story has gone before them. Now, that's not the first time we've seen that. And that'll be a recurring theme, not just in Exodus, but actually throughout the Pentateuch, for the next few books. Because what happens is that last week, why did the Amalekites show up? The Amalekites show up, they see them, they hear about them, they decide they need to destroy them. Here, Jethro sees them, he hears about them, here's what's happening. The good news are the news of what God has been doing in Egypt and in the Red Sea is big, and it's going before him. People are hearing about it. In the Song of Moses, we were thinking about it. We've been resonating with this idea that the word is spreading. God goes before them. He's heard all that God has done for Moses, and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. And so now he shows up. And he shows up, well, there's some interesting questions. We don't really know the details of what happens next. Verse 2, it says, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had taken Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he'd sent her home, along with her 2 sons. The name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I've been a sojourner in a foreign land. And the name of the other, Eleazar, for he said, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. Jethro then, he shows up, and he's there with Moses. But he's there bringing his wife, Moses' wife, and his sons back. Now, that's the big question. They say, well, what happened? Why did he send them away? Now, there's a range of views. There's one view that Moses actually had divorced her by this point. And that phrase, sent away, is used at times to speak of a divorce. The problem is that we have no evidence elsewhere of that. So you're reading a lot into one phrase. And you're also reading something that just seems at odds with the entire relationship as it unfolds. He's bringing her back. There's this warm welcome. They greet each other warmly. There's a great relationship here. And in fact, Moses pauses to spell out the names in the way that the names of his sons themselves are a celebration of God's provision. So it's textually possible, but seems really unlikely. And the more likely thing is one of 2 things happen. Either he sent her away when he was going into Egypt itself. He actually sent them back after we read about Zipporah when he was circumcising the son and all these things. So it may have been that he sent them back to say, I'm just going to keep you at safe bay while I'm going through this. Or I think the most reasonable thing is, she's with him all that time. They cross the Red Sea. They're wandering through the desert. She's not far from home, and she wants to take the kids home and go see Grandpa for a couple days, which I think what happens here. I think that's the simplest explanation and probably is what happens and most consistent with the positive vibe you get in this section. But nonetheless, Jethro's heard. He's heard about this, and he wants to know more, which is what's going to happen here. And then you see this warm relationship, and that's the next thing I want you to see, is that evangelism thrives in a context of real tolerance. So the gospel, God goes before us, and I think that's important for us to see as we think about the topic of evangelism, which is a topic that makes all of us uncomfortable. One thing we need to take courage in is that when we're there doing evangelism, or thinking about evangelism, or imagining the possibility of thinking about evangelism, we're not doing anything that God isn't already doing. God is revealing himself. God is working in the world. God even reveals himself by the simple fact that a non-believer wakes up every morning with maybe a job to go to, or they live underneath a sun and sky, and there's rain, and there's food on the table. All of this, read Romans 1, is a testimony of God's provision. God is testifying to who he is, even before we say a word. But the second thing is that evangelism thrives in a context of real tolerance. Now, that's a dangerous word that I'm using there, but I think we should use it. I think we need to take it back and rescue it. When I hear the word tolerance today, when I hear it used, most often what I hear from our world is that tolerance means something like all viewpoints are valid. Or like, you can believe whatever you want, and we're going to tolerate each other, which means you're actually, whatever your opinion is, it's a good and beautiful thing, even though I think it's crazy. That's not tolerance at all. That's actually a quite intolerant view. I like how John Dixon, he's an evangelist actually, he writes this about tolerance. He said, true tolerance does not involve accepting every viewpoint as true and valid. It involves treating with love and humility someone whose opinions you believe to be untrue and invalid. So tolerance is, I think your viewpoints are wackadoodle, and I'm going to love you anyway. And I'm actually going to love you enough to acknowledge that sometimes I'm wrong too. And so we can actually learn how to live together despite our differences. That's that's old school tolerance that's often been lost in our culture. But you see that's exactly what they have here. What do you see in this relationship? Verse 6, he sent word to Moses. He says, here, I'm here. So verse 7, Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. And they asked each other of their welfare and went into the tent. There's this warm, welcoming, hospitable relationship. Moses has known this guy for 40 years. He's a priest in Midian, which tells you he is not just doesn't believe in Yahweh. He's actually leading the other people in a worship of a false god. There's a lot that they could disagree about. Moses is, at the time that he meets him, he is in exile because he is so passionate about the person of Yahweh, about Yahweh, that he would actually then try to kill the guy that's trying to abuse his own people. There's this warm and rich relationship. They can love and care for each other. And that love is not contingent on Jethro agreeing with Moses. I think that's the foundation of evangelism. Evangelism is ultimately found not in stranger interactions, but most of it is found, the bread and butter is found in relationship. The people who we love and care for. It's those that God puts on our heart to say, here's the person that I'm burdened for. And there are people that you will have in your life that you will feel a burden for, that you're going to be willing to pray for decades, that no one else will have that burden for. God has put that burden on your heart. And it's going to come out of that sense of loving relationship. What old school, the idea is real tolerance. And then what happens? They have this warm, loving relationship. They're catching up on old times. And Jethro said, hey, I've heard some rumors. Tell me about this. And then verse 9, then Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done. Which is the third idea I want you to see, is that the believer's job here is to faithfully tell the story of what God has done. What do? We tell the story. What did Moses do? He just told the story. And as he's telling the story, It is not a celebration of Moses. It's not a celebration of all that he had done. It's a celebration of what Yahweh had done, or what the Lord had done. And to Pharaoh, to the Egyptians, all the hardship that had come upon them in the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. He's just telling the story. And that, at its very essence, that's what we do as we share the gospel with others. We're simply telling the story. And that's an intimidating thing. You say, well, I'm not an expert, I'm not a scholar, I don't have all the right answers. But you have a story. And you have a story of how God has shaped you and changed you. You have a testimony. And it's somewhere in that story you can simply testify, here's what God has done. This is what God has done in my life. Here's what God is doing in my life. Your space, our space, is to faithfully tell the story. God's gone before us. God's doing a work. God's declaring himself in countless and myriad ways. And here we are, like Moses, we're simply recounting what they had done. And the response here, verse 9, and Jethro rejoiced for all the good that the Lord had done to Israel, in that he had delivered them out of the hands of the Egyptians. And notice verse 10. I think it's a beautiful picture. Blessed be the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord, Yahweh, is greater than all gods, because in this affair they dealt arrogantly with the people. Now some debate, there's a debate here about whether or not Jethro is a believer here. And some think he isn't. There's little things, they'll point to points where he does not actually use the name Yahweh, he uses Elohim. But I'm not sure. I think it seems more likely that he's actually celebrating Yahweh here, that he's actually expressing faith. But I think it's a picture of faith. And the response of faith, as modeled here with Jethro, is a response of delight. He looks at what God has done, and he celebrates. He delights in the goodness of God, the provision of God, and he sees the superiority. That Yahweh is greater than all the other gods. That's the driver here. Now notice how that sits alongside last week of the Amalekites. This is another interaction of God and God's people interacting with the people of the land and other nations. And so some of these nations, they see them as enemies. They're going to attack them. And there is a judgment that will come down upon them. Last week with the Amalekites, God saying there will be an eternal war against them for attacking his people. Amalekites now become even worse than the Canaanites. There is this judgment that is coming down upon them. But there are some, Jethro models this other reaction, that they see the work of God before them and they delight in it. And they see the proof that Yahweh is not just, I think there's a subtle image here. It's not that he's simply greater than the other gods, but they have proven that these other gods are false gods. And I think that's a theme, an underlying tone that you see throughout the Old Testament. They'll talk about these other gods as if they're real, and God is just the best of all of them. There's other sense where ultimately they say these gods are really no gods at all. And I think that's what he's discovering here. These gods, these little gods that the Egyptians have created, they really are no gods at all. And the Egyptians, in their arrogance, thought that Yahweh was nothing, and Yahweh has proven himself the greater. So, God has gone before. He's announced his story. He's told them what he's doing. Moses has a relationship of tolerance and love and that he can just share his story of what God has done. And that's all he does, is share the story. And Jethro's response is to delight in it. Moses doesn't control the response. We don't control the response when we share our faith. We can't control how people respond. That's a divine transaction. God has that. Our task is to share. So there's this beautiful picture that emerges out here of Jethro. Moses is sharing this faith with this non-Israelite who responds and delights in the work of God. Becomes a beautiful testimony. One of these threads I want to keep pulling when we see it throughout Exodus, that you see this sense of mission. The people of Israel aren't just being redeemed for their own sake. They're being redeemed, and they are testifying to the nations of the goodness and mercy of God. We've already seen it before when people left. They said they left Egypt. It was a great multitude. It was Israel with other nations represented. Other folks said, yeah, I'm with Team Israel on this one. I'm with Team Yahweh. I want to go with these guys. And sure enough, we were just talking with our kids' class this morning, when they get to Canaan, who is it that's going to join them? None less than Rahab the prostitute. A Canaanite prostitute will help deliver the spies. She will be redeemed as Jericho is destroyed around her. She becomes part of the lineage of Jesus. Another picture of these non-Israel people who see what God is doing and say, I want to be part of that. All of that is an anticipation of who we are as the church, a gathering of people from every nation, tribe, and tongue, responding in faith to the good news of who Jesus is and what he has done for us. It's a great celebration of the gospel that goes as the people of God work in mission. And then the second piece of that, as he moves from there, he's rejoicing, he's celebrating. Then he becomes an observer of how they work together. And in that we see now a picture of the community. And Moses wants us to think about how is it that the people of Israel will share the work together. Verse 13, it says, the next day Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood around Moses from morning till evening. And when Moses, his father-in-law, saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, what is this that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone, and all the people stand around you from morning till evening? And Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come to me, and I decide between one person and another, and I make them know the statutes of God and his laws. So here you have a picture of a man who's on the verge of exhaustion. And the first thing I want you to see here is that the road to exhaustion is often paved with good intentions. What is Moses doing? He's sitting here from morning till evening as a judge of the people. He's sitting, and everyone else is standing. And it turns out that that's really hard on both of them. Jethro's response is, hey, what you're doing, verse 17, is not good. You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy. It's not just hard on Moses, it's hard on them. They're wasting all this time having to stand here for hours on end, waiting to see the judge. And there's only one judge. And they're really tired having to wait for him. And Moses is the one judge having to sit there all day long and deal with every issue and dispute. And why does he do it? Well, his answer is, well, they come to me to inquire of God. Well, that's the weight of the calling that he has. Moses is trying to be faithful. God has called him. He's appointed him this task. He's a prophet to the people. He is, as he says, you'll be like God to them. That's what he's doing. He's the one that brings insight into this is who God is. This is God's law. This is how it works. So he's trying to be faithful to that calling. And the way that he's doing, born out of good intentions, creates a context for burnout on his part, and really on the part of the people. It's bad for him, and it's bad for them. And that's, I think, what Jethro points out to them is a great truth for us, which is this, that we are all limited. And those limitations will be part of our lives in ministry. Every single one of us is limited. Now, that's hard to say, because we want to say God can accomplish whatever he wants. God can do amazing things through broken people. But, that's true, but God also creates us all with limitations. None of us are built to go 24/7, 365. All of us get tired. All of us get weak. All of us get worn down. We can only do so much. And just as Jethro says to Moses, this thing is too heavy for you. Every single one of us will encounter ministry burdens, family burdens, challenges we face that we have to be able to say, this thing is too heavy for me. And there is a certain amount of pride at times that come in to say, no, I can bear this thing. I can do this. But we can't. And Jethro is giving Moses this beautiful gift of offering him that insight before Moses is willing to admit it himself. What if Jethro says nothing? Just goes down the road, Moses keeps on doing it. At some point, there's a complete breakdown. Completely, he just can't keep doing it. He's built for something else. He needs to balance it. There's an interesting tension, I think, that reflects this in Galatians chapter 6. That reflects this kind of burden. It says this. Paul says in Galatians 6, Well, I just lost the thread of it. I'll just summarize it. It talks about two different words it uses. He said, you each have a burden, and we're going to carry each other's burdens. Lily, you can look up the text. Let me shout it out when you get there. Carry each other's burdens. And then it says just a few verses later, each one is going to carry his own load. I think that's a beautiful distinction that we really need to trouble with together. That Moses has a load to carry. There is nobody here on the scene that will ever say, guess what, you're now a prophet of God. No. He's not. There's no one else. Moses will be the prophet. Moses is the one that carries that. But you notice there's a burden that he is not carrying by himself. And we've already seen this before. He had Aaron come along the way. He's had Miriam. Last week we had Miriam's husband. All of these folks have come alongside him already. And even last week as he's holding up, what's the text? 6:2-5. There we go. See, I just looked at the wrong verse. And Moses is holding up as his arms. His arms get weary, and so Aaron and Hur are tossing up those arms, keeping him going. Moses, writing this, is telling us again and again, look, I'm weak. I didn't have the strength. I didn't have the courage back when God told me to do this. That's why he gave me Aaron. All of these ways that Moses keeps talking about his weakness and reminding them of his weakness, and how God is raising up people to come alongside him to hold up that burden together. And here, Jethro is the one that can have the courage to speak to the prophet and say, yeah, what you're doing is not good. You need help. You need something different. And so he tells them his advice. Verse 19 said, now obey my voice. I'll give you advice, and God be with you. You shall represent the people before God and bring their cases to God, and you shall warn them about the statutes and the laws and make them know the way in which they must walk and what they must do. That's your load to carry. You'll do all of that, and you'll keep doing that. Moreover, then, verse 21, look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy and hate a bribe, and place such men over the people as chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens, and let them judge the people at all times. Every great matter they bring to you, any small matter they decide for themselves. He's setting up a court system, and he's got it really structured. You got districts, and you got appellate levels, you got tens and fifties and hundreds and thousands, all this organization. And he's creating this space where they can share this burden together. And that's the third thing I want you to see, is that the church is a place of shared burdens, both in ministry and in life. He's creating a court system. And what does he want? Well, find people of integrity. He said, find men who fear God, who are trustworthy, who hate bribes. That's really important to have a good judge. Cook County never learned that lesson. I don't know why. But have quality people of character, men of integrity, that don't like bribes and don't want to cheat. Like, that's what you want in a judge. So find qualified people, and let's build this structure so they can say, yeah, I can handle that, but this is too big. This one needs to go up the chain. This one needs to come to you. And so they share the burden. They carry each other's burdens. So Moses has a load to carry. He's got a responsibility in his life, and no one can take that from him. That's the load that he's carrying. And you're going to have loads in your life to say, this is the thing I've got. Here's the task I've been given. I've got this relationship, and I'm here. I'm going to be caring for this person. I've got this disease I'm fighting with. This is mine. This is the load I have to carry. But you also have a burden that you do not need to carry. You don't need to carry it alone. And that we can come alongside one another in times of sickness, in times of need, in times of stress and distress. All the struggles we can find, we can learn how can we carry each other's burdens so that the load that each one of us has to carry ourselves can feel a little bit lighter. So that's that picture of a restored relationship. So notice here in chapter 18 that God is picturing both how his work is restoring people into relationship with God. Jethro here is about the work of God among Israel. He has Moses tell him the story, and he delights. It's a picture of responding in faith, to delight with God. And then in the second half of 18, you see how Jethro is then ministering to Moses to learn how they can build a community of people who can share one another's burdens, who can carry the burden together. And that's what I want us to see today, how the gospel draws us to the relationships we most need in the midst of a lonely culture. We live in a culture of loneliness where we're told, we just have an ingrained sense to be an American is to be on your own, to be a self-made man, to be a self-made person. You're in this, it's this rugged individualist. If you don't like your family, just leave them. If you don't like what you're around, just do something else. Just go your own way. Be a cowboy. And the gospel gives us something so much better. The gospel restores us first in our relationship with God. And in restoring us into a relationship with God, he inherently draws us into relationships with one another. Because he saves us not as individuals, he saves us as a church. He calls us to be part of his people. We become one with one another. We are drawn into a relationship so that we can share one another's burdens, carry one another's burdens, as each of us carry our own load. And so we can see and share what God has done. And that's my encouragement to you. Let's learn how to see and share what God has done in our lives, the testimony of what we have as we learn to love and care for one another. And then let's help each other carry our burdens together. Because God has restored us in relationship with him, with one another, changed how we think about ourselves, changed our relationship with creation itself. We can contend against a culture of loneliness through the gospel of Jesus Christ together. Let's pray. God, I ask your blessing on each of us as each of us carries different loads. I pray that you will give us hearts that yearn to carry one another's burdens. Teach us how to love and care for one another, to share those burdens together. And in doing so, to just create further testimony of your goodness and your provision for us. Give us that courage as we go into the world to love and care for those that we may not agree with, those that we love and care for that walk very different paths, and give us the courage to speak of what you have done for us, that we might give them that invitation to delight in you themselves. In Jesus' name, amen. If we can help you in any way, please come while we stand and sing.